The year was 1878, a time when the untamed wilderness of the Texas Territory held both promise and peril for those who dared to traverse its rugged landscape. For those who journeyed through the winding canyon roads, dreams of new beginnings could shatter in an instant, replaced by the harsh reality of survival against merciless odds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blood on Catherine Blackwood's hands had dried to a deep rust color, flaking off as she clutched the small derringer pistol her uncle had insisted she carry before they left St. Louis. 4 days had passed since the attack. 4 days since she had hidden in a narrow crevice of the canyon wall, pressing her fist against her mouth to muffle her screams as the sounds of death echoed around her. 4 days after the Silverline stagecoach, carrying 8 passengers bound, for Fort Davis had been ambushed in the twisting passages of Shadow Canyon. Catherine had been gathering wildflowers near a small spring when the first shots rang out. The thunderous crack of rifles shattered the peaceful afternoon, followed by screams that would haunt her for however long she had left to live. She had dropped instantly, her body responding before her mind could process what was happening. Years of growing up with 3 rowdy brothers had taught her to move swiftly and silently, and now that skill kept her alive as she crawled through the scrubby brush away from the stage, but not far enough to avoid witnessing the slaughter. Now she was alone in the vast expanse of Shadow Canyon, a place where towering rock walls streaked with copper and crimson loomed overhead, making her feel increasingly insignificant with each passing hour. Her chestnut hair hung in dirty tangles around her face, once elegantly pinned, but now wild and matted with dust. Her green traveling dress was torn at the sleeve and hem, stained with dirt and blood. Some hers, some not. The late April heat baked the canyon floor during the day, while nights brought a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep directly from the ancient stones. Catherine knew that if dehydration didn't claim her first, the coyotes or something worse surely would. She had taken what she could from the massacre site after the attackers left, a canteen 3/4 full of water, her uncle's pocket watch that had fallen during the chaos, her small derringer with 2 precious bullets and a worn leather satchel containing some dried beef and hardtack. Nothing else had been salvageable. The raiders had been thorough in their destruction. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from thirst and disuse. Just keep moving. But toward what? Catherine had no clear destination, only the vague understanding that she needed to find water, shelter, or any sign of civilization. The Silverline stage had been following the newly established southern route to Fort Davis, but in her panic and confusion after the attack, she'd lost track of the main trail. Each step was becoming more difficult than the last. Her fashionable half-boots, never intended for such terrain, had rubbed raw blisters on her heels that burst and bled anew with every step. The derringer she carried offered little comfort against the vastness of the wilderness or the threats it contained. As twilight approached, Catherine sought shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation, gathering what dry brush she could find to create some meager protection against the night winds. She had no means to start a fire. The matches had been in her uncle's coat pocket, and James Blackwood's body lay back at the massacre site, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. James Blackwood had been a respected judge from Missouri, traveling to Fort Davis to help establish the territorial court system. After Catherine's parents died in a riverboat accident 3 years ago, he had convinced her that a fresh start in Texas was what they both needed. The stagecoach journey was supposed to be the beginning of their new life, not the end of everything she'd ever known. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the distant howl of coyotes and the constant gnawing fear that kept her heart racing. When dawn broke, Catherine forced herself to her feet despite the protests of her aching body. The morning was clear, the sun rising to cast long shadows across the canyon floor. She allowed herself a small sip from the canteen, rationing what little water remained before steeling her resolve. Her mother had always said Catherine had determination enough for 3 people. It was time to prove her right. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, the heat radiating from the canyon walls, creating an oven-like effect that sapped Catherine's strength with every step. Still, she pushed forward, following the canyon's gradual descent in hopes it would lead to water. It was during a brief rest, in the shadow of a large boulder, that she spotted it, a thin trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock face, gathering in a small depression below. Her heart leapt into her throat. Water, the most precious resource in this desolate place. Catherine moved toward it with renewed energy, falling to her knees beside the tiny pool. She filled her canteen first, practicality overriding immediate desire, then cupped her hands to drink directly from the source. The water was cool and tasted of minerals, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever experienced. As she drank, a small movement caught her eye, a lizard, barely visible against the rock, watching her with unblinking eyes. "I don't suppose you know the way out of here?" She asked it with a wry smile, her first in days. The creature darted away into a crevice, leaving her alone once more. Catherine splashed water on her face, washing away layers of dust and dried tears. The momentary relief allowed her mind to focus beyond immediate survival. For the first time since the attack, who had ambushed the stagecoach? They weren't Mexican bandits, as she had initially feared. They had spoken English, their accents suggesting origins from further east, and they hadn't been interested in robbing the passengers so much as eliminating them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One phrase kept returning to her mind, something she'd overheard as she hid trembling in the rocks. "Make sure they're all dead. No witnesses. The judge especially. The judge especially. Her uncle. This hadn't been a random attack. It had been an assassination disguised as a bandit raid. But why? What case had her uncle been involved in that would warrant such brutality? As these thoughts tumbled through her mind, Catherine replenished her water supply and prepared to continue her journey. She had to reach Fort Davis, had to tell someone what she'd heard, what she suspected. But first, she had to survive. The afternoon stretched before her, each step a small victory against exhaustion and despair. As the sun began its descent, casting the canyon in deepening shadow, Catherine's senses, honed by days of heightened awareness, detected something different in the air. A stillness had fallen, the small sounds of desert life suddenly muted. She wasn't alone. Catherine froze, her hand moving instinctively to the derringer tucked in her pocket. Her eyes scanned the rocky terrain around her, searching for movement, for any sign of what had triggered her unease. Nothing. Then a small displacement of air behind her, the barest hint of movement. She whirled, weapon half drawn, to find herself face to face with a man who seemed to have materialized from the very stones themselves. He stood motionless, watching her with obsidian eyes that reflected no surprise at their encounter. His features spoke of Comanche heritage, high cheekbones, copper skin weathered by sun and wind, black hair falling past his shoulders with a single eagle feather woven into a thin braid. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that seemed of white man's making, with a bone breastplate decorating his chest. A knife was sheathed at his belt and a rifle slung across his back, but his hands remained empty at his sides, not threatening, merely present. For what seemed an eternity, they regarded each other in silence. Catherine's heart thundered in her chest, her mind racing with the stories she'd heard growing up. Tales of Comanche raids, of captives taken, of brutality on both sides of a cultural divide she barely understood. Finally the man spoke, his English accented but clear. "You bleed." He gestured toward her boots, where fresh blood had seeped through the leather from her blistered feet. Catherine didn't lower the derringer, though her hand trembled with fatigue. "Who are you? What do you want?" The questions came out harsher than she intended, fear sharpening her tone. "Ta-ta-ka," he replied, touching his chest. Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call me Swift Shadow." "Are you going to kill me?" Catherine asked directly, seeing no point in circumventing her greatest fear. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps respect, crossed his stoic features. "If wanting you dead, you already dead, found your trail 2 days ago." This revelation sent a chill through Catherine. He had been tracking her for days without her knowledge, could have approached her at any time, when she slept, when she was at her most vulnerable. "Why follow me?" she demanded. The derringer still pointed at him, though they both knew it would do little good if he decided to attack. Swift Shadow studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing. Curious. White. Woman alone in canyon, not common. Despite her exhaustion and fear, Catherine felt a spark of indignation. "I'm not here by choice. There was an attack." "I know," he interrupted. "Saw dead stage. Saw men who did this." His expression darkened. "Not Comanche work. White men dressed to look like Indian raiders." Catherine's suspicion faltered slightly. He had seen the aftermath, perhaps even witnessed the attackers. They killed everyone. My uncle, the driver, all the passengers. "Not everyone," Swift Shadow countered, his eyes never leaving hers. "You live." This simple statement, the acknowledgement of her survival against all odds, nearly undid Catherine's fragile composure. She swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. "Yes, I live." Swift Shadow nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. Then he glanced at the darkening sky. "Night comes. Not safe here." "Nowhere is safe," Catherine responded. But she knew he was right. The narrow section of canyon where they stood offered little protection, and the temperature was already beginning to drop precipitously with the setting sun. "No safe place," Swift Shadow said, gesturing deeper into the canyon. "Hidden cave. Water inside." Catherine hesitated, the derringer still half raised between them. Trust a stranger, a Comanche no less, or face another night alone in the increasingly hostile wilderness. What choice did she truly have? "Why help me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation before taking such a risk. Swift Shadow's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted, a shadow of memory or pain quickly masked. "Men who attacked stage same men who raid Comanche camps, blame white settlers, create war between our peoples." He adjusted the rifle strap across his shoulder. "They are enemy to both." The revelation struck Catherine with the force of certainty. It aligned perfectly with what she had heard during the attack, the deliberate nature of the violence, the specific targeting of her uncle. These weren't random bandits, they were mercenaries with an agenda. Slowly, she lowered the derringer, her decision made. "Lead the way." Swift Shadow nodded once, then turned and began moving with fluid grace through the rocky terrain. Catherine followed, pushing aside her lingering doubts. She had survived 4 days in the wilderness through luck and determination. Perhaps now she needed something more, an ally, however unexpected. As they navigated the deepening shadows of the canyon, Catherine couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn her fate had taken. She had left St. Louis, a judge's niece, bound for a respectable new life in Fort Davis. Now she was following a Comanche tracker into the unknown, her former life scattered like dust in the wind behind her. The hidden cave proved to be more than Catherine had dared hope. Concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines and brush that grew improbably from a crack in the rock face, the entrance opened into a space large enough to stand in comfortably. The real treasure, however, was at the back of the cave, a small spring bubbling up from the rock, forming a clear pool before disappearing back into the stone. Swift Shadow built a small fire near the entrance, positioning it so the smoke would disperse through the vines rather than collecting in the cave. The warm light transformed the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the space feel almost welcoming. Catherine sank down against the cool rock wall, her legs finally giving out after days of relentless movement. Swift Shadow worked in silence, efficiently setting up their temporary shelter. From a leather pouch at his waist, he produced strips of dried meat and some kind of cake made of pounded berries and nuts. "Eat," he said, offering her a portion. "Need strength." The food was unfamiliar but sustaining, rich with flavors Catherine couldn't identify. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that this was the first proper meal she'd had since the attack. As the food and relative safety began to restore her, questions that had been suppressed by immediate survival needs resurfaced. "These men," she began, watching Swift Shadow as he tended the fire. "The ones who attacked the stage. You said they raid Comanche camps, too?" Swift Shadow looked up, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. "Yes, for 2 seasons now. Attack Comanche, take scalps, leave white man things behind, whiskey bottles, metal from fort. Then attack white settlers, take scalps, leave Comanche arrows." His expression hardened. "Many dead on both sides. Army sends more soldiers. Comanche bands talk of great war." "But who would want that?" Catherine asked, though even as the question left her lips, understanding began to dawn. "Land," she whispered. "If there's war, the army will drive the Comanche out completely." Swift Shadow nodded grimly. "Rich grazing land, good water, men. In big towns want it." He pointed east toward civilization. "Make war, take land when both sides weak." The pieces aligned with terrible clarity in Catherine's mind. Her uncle, Judge James Blackwood, had been traveling to Fort Davis to establish legal oversight of land claims and treaties. He had mentioned concerns about fraudulent dealings and conflicts of interest among certain territorial officials. "My uncle," she said slowly, "was going to Fort Davis to review land claims. She hesitated, trying to recall his exact words from their conversations during the journey. "He said something about unscrupulous men trying to circumvent the treaties through manufactured conflicts." Swift Shadow's gaze sharpened with interest. "Judge knew of these plans?" "I think so," Catherine replied, the full weight of the situation settling over her. "That's why they made sure to kill him. He was going to expose them." A moment of silence passed between them as they both processed the implications. Finally, Swift Shadow spoke, his voice carrying a new note of urgency. "Then you must live to speak his words. Tell what you know." Catherine nodded, determination hardening within her. "Yes, I need to reach Fort Davis." She glanced down at her battered boots and torn dress, a bitter laugh escaping her. "If I can make it that far." "I no way," Swift Shadow said simply. "Can guide you." Catherine looked at him in surprise. "You would do that? Enter a fort full of soldiers who might shoot you on sight?" "Not enter fort," he clarified. "Take you close. Safe path few know." "Why risk yourself for me?" Catherine asked, genuinely puzzled by his willingness to help. Swift Shadow was silent for a long moment, gazing into the small fire. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of personal cost. 6 moons ago, raiders attacked my brother's camp while I was hunting. Killed many, including his wife, his son." His voice remained steady, but his hand tightened on the knife at his belt. "Army blamed Comanche for attack on nearby ranch that same day. Said we sought revenge for soldiers at Water Wright's place." Your brother's family died because of these same men, Catherine said softly, understanding the connection now. Yes. Tracked them since. Learned their ways, their paths. His dark eyes met hers across the fire. Now find you, someone who can tell white man's law what happens. Make them listen in way I cannot. In that moment, Catherine saw beyond the cultural differences that separated them, beyond the prejudices and fears she had been raised with. She saw simply a man seeking justice for loved ones lost, just as she was. Their paths had converged. Through shared tragedy, their goals aligned by circumstances neither could have foreseen. "We leave at first light," Swift Shadow said, ending the conversation with practical matters. "Sleep now. Need strength for journey." As Catherine settled herself as comfortably as possible on the cave floor, using her satchel as a pillow, she felt something she had not experienced since the attack, a tentative hope. She was no longer alone in her quest for survival and justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for this moment, in this unlikely sanctuary with this unexpected ally, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps there was a path forward after all. Outside, the desert night came alive with sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through canyon walls, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Inside the cave, the small fire crackled softly, its light falling on two figures from different worlds, united by a common enemy, and a shared determination to survive. Catherine's last thought before exhaustion claimed her was of her uncle's favorite saying, "Justice may travel by unexpected roads, but it always reaches its destination in the end." Perhaps, she reflected, as sleep overtook her, this strange road she now traveled was justice finding its way after all. The night passed in dreamless sleep for Catherine, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of days on the run. When she awoke, pale dawn light was filtering through the vine curtain at the cave entrance, and Swift Shadow was already preparing for their departure. He knelt by the remains of the fire, wrapping dried meat and pine nuts in large leaves. His movements were efficient, practiced, a man accustomed to traveling light and leaving quickly. Catherine pushed herself upright, wincing as her body protested. Every muscle ached from days of walking, and the blisters on her feet throbbed painfully. "Good. You wake," Swift Shadow said without looking up from his task. "Must move soon. Men still search." Catherine stiffened. "The attackers? They're still looking for me?" Now Swift Shadow did look at her, his expression grave. "Yes. Found their trail yesterday. 6 men moving through canyon, checking places where someone might hide." A chill ran through Catherine despite the growing warmth of the day. "How far?" "Half-day's ride south, moving this way." He finished his packing and stood, studying her with critical eyes. "Cannot travel in those," he said, pointing to her ruined boots. "Slow us down. Leave blood trail." Catherine glanced down at her footwear, knowing he was right, but seeing no alternative. "I don't have anything else." Swift Shadow reached into a small bundle near the cave wall that she hadn't noticed before. From it, he produced a pair of moccasins, crafted from soft deer hide and decorated with simple beadwork. "For you," he said, offering them to her. "Made for trading, better for quiet walking." Catherine took the moccasins, touched by the unexpected gift. "Thank you," she said softly, genuinely grateful. As she removed her boots to try them on, she couldn't suppress a small gasp at the state of her feet, blistered, bloody, and swollen. Without comment, Swift Shadow retrieved a small pouch from his belt. From it, he took a greenish paste that smelled of herbs and earth. "Medicine," he explained, handing it to her. "Put on sores before moccasins. Will help healing, stop pain." Catherine applied the paste gingerly, surprised by the immediate cooling sensation it produced. Within moments, the throbbing pain had subsided to a manageable discomfort. The moccasins fit well enough, and when she stood to test them, the difference was remarkable. Instead of the unyielding leather that had been torturing her feet, the soft hide conformed to her steps, providing protection without further damage. "Better," Swift Shadow observed with a nod of approval. "Now can move faster, quieter." They gathered their few supplies and prepared to leave the sanctuary of the cave. Before they stepped out, Swift Shadow paused, his hand on her arm. "Stay close. Step where I step. Speak little." His dark eyes held hers with serious intensity. "Men follow us have no mercy. Kill you quick, kill me slow." Catherine nodded, the stark reality of their situation settling heavily upon her. These weren't just bandits. They were professional killers who had already demonstrated their ruthlessness at the stagecoach. And if they caught her with a Comanche, they would likely inflict particular cruelty on Swift Shadow before killing him. They emerged from the cave into the cool morning air, Swift Shadow carefully rearranging the vines to conceal the entrance. Behind them, the canyon looked different in the early light, less threatening, almost beautiful, with the rising sun painting the rock walls in shades of gold and amber. Swift Shadow led them on a path that seemed to materialize before Catherine's eyes. Narrow ledges, hidden passages between boulders, dry stream beds that offered concealment. They traveled in silence for the most part, her guide occasionally pointing out a particular plant with medicinal properties or a sign of animal passage that would have been invisible to her untrained eye. By midday, they had made considerable progress, following the canyon's winding course northward. Swift Shadow set a challenging pace, but the moccasins and healing paste made it possible for Catherine to keep up without the debilitating pain of previous days. During a brief rest in the shadow of a towering rock formation, Catherine gathered her courage to ask the question that had been forming in her mind. "These men, do you know who leads them? Who would have the resources and motivation to orchestrate all this?" Swift Shadow took a drink from his water skin before answering. "Have seen one man many times, always watching, never fighting himself. Gives orders, others follow." He described a tall man with a distinctive limp and a scar that ran from eye to jaw on the left side of his face. "Wears black coat, even in heat. Has silver watch he looks at often." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The description matched perfectly with a man she had seen speaking with the territorial governor at a reception in St. Louis, just before she and her uncle departed. "Clayton Reed," she whispered, the name coming back to her. "He was introduced as a land development investor." Uncle James refused to shake his hand, said later that Reed represented everything wrong with how the territory was being carved up. "Reed," Swift Shadow repeated, committing the name to memory. "He is the snake's head. Cut off head, snake dies." The metaphor was apt, if unsettling. If Reed was indeed behind the campaign of violence and the assassination of her uncle, then he would have significant resources and connections at his disposal. Reaching Fort Davis alive was becoming more than a matter of physical survival. It was their only chance to expose a conspiracy that threatened both their peoples. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound froze them both in place, the unmistakable report of a rifle echoing through the canyon walls. Swift Shadow's reaction was immediate. He pulled Catherine into the shadow of an overhanging ledge, his body tense with alertness. "How far?" she whispered, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. "Not far. Echo makes difficult to know." "Exactly." His eyes scanned the terrain ahead, calculating. Could be hunting, could be signal to others. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the faint sound of men's voices carried on the wind. "Not hunting," Swift Shadow concluded grimly. "Searching, organized search." Catherine fought against rising panic. "What do we do?" Swift Shadow considered their options, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he pointed. toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, about 50 yards ahead. There, side canyon leads to high ground. Can see who follows, how many. They moved quickly but cautiously, staying close to the rock wall where their figures would be less visible against the stone. The side canyon proved to be little more than a crack in the massive rock formation, barely wide enough for them to pass through single file. Swift Shadow led the way, Catherine following so closely she could feel the heat radiating from his back. The passage twisted upward at a steep angle, requiring them to use hands and feet to climb in some sections. Catherine's muscles protested, the new exertion, but fear provided enough motivation to overcome discomfort. After several minutes of difficult ascent, the fissure opened onto a small plateau about 30 feet above the main canyon floor. Swift Shadow immediately took up position behind a large boulder at the edge, gesturing for Catherine to stay low as she joined him. From this vantage point, they had a clear view down into the main canyon, including the path they had been following. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, 3 riders appeared, moving slowly along the canyon floor, their eyes scanning the terrain with practiced thoroughness. They were hard-looking men, armed with rifles and pistols, their manner suggesting military training despite their civilian attire. "Scouts!" Swift Shadow whispered. "Others will be behind." "They'll see our tracks," Catherine realized with growing dread. "Yes, soon." As if on cue, one of the riders dismounted, kneeling to examine something on the ground. He called to his companions, pointing toward the very fissure where Catherine and Swift Shadow had escaped. "They know," Catherine breathed, fighting to keep her voice steady. Swift Shadow's expression hardened as he reached for his rifle. "Must delay them, give us time to reach high country." "You're going to shoot them?" Catherine asked, conflicted. These men were murderers who had killed her uncle and countless others, yet the thought of cold-blooded killing disturbed her deeply. "No choice," Swift Shadow replied simply. "They find us. We die." He positioned his rifle on the rock, taking careful aim at the mounted men below. Catherine knew he was right, but something made her put her hand on his arm. "Wait, look." In the distance, a cloud of dust was approaching rapidly from the south. More riders, at least a dozen by the look of it. But these wore the unmistakable blue uniforms of U.S. cavalry. "Soldiers," Swift Shadow said, tension evident in his voice. For him, the arrival of the army was potentially as dangerous as Reed's men. The scouts below had also spotted the approaching cavalry. With barely a moment's hesitation, they mounted their horses and disappeared around a bend in the canyon, clearly unwilling to encounter official military presence. "The cavalry must be patrolling for raids," Catherine said, hope flaring briefly. "If we could reach them." "No," Swift Shadow cut her off firmly. "Cannot trust army. Reed has men everywhere. Some soldiers take orders from him, not army chief." Catherine wanted to argue, but knew he might be right. Clayton Reed's influence seemed to extend throughout the territory's power structures. There was no way to know if these particular soldiers were honest men or in Reed's pocket. "Then what do we do?" she asked, watching as the cavalry patrol entered the section of canyon below them, moving at a steady trot. Swift Shadow was already backing away from the edge, pulling her with him. "Go higher, different path, more difficult but safer." They retreated from their observation point, moving deeper into the maze of rock formations that crowned the canyon walls. Swift Shadow led them through passages Catherine would never have discovered on her own. Narrow defiles between towering stones, ancient handholds carved into sheer rock faces, ledges barely wide enough for a foothold. The ascent was grueling, especially for Catherine in her weakened state. Several times she thought she couldn't continue, her arms trembling with the effort of pulling herself up yet another rock face. Each time, Swift Shadow seemed to sense her flagging strength, finding a brief resting place or offering a hand at precisely the right moment. By late afternoon, they had reached a height that allowed them to see for miles across the canyonlands. The view was breathtaking. A vast network of stone corridors cut by millennia of water and wind, stretching to distant mountains shimmering in the heat haze. "There," Swift Shadow said, pointing northward to where a thin line of green marked the horizon. River Valley. Beyond that, Fort Davis, 2 days' journey. Catherine shaded her eyes, trying to gauge the distance. "Can we reach the river by nightfall?" Swift Shadow studied the terrain and the position of the sun. "If move fast, no more rest." Despite her exhaustion, Catherine nodded her agreement. "Then, let's move fast." They began their descent down the far side of the ridge, following a series of switchbacks that wound their way gradually toward the canyon floor. The path was treacherous in places, loose shale giving way underfoot, requiring constant attention to avoid a disastrous fall. As they navigated a particularly narrow ledge, a shower of small stones from above was their only warning before a man appeared on the ridge they had just descended, rifle raised. "There she is!" he shouted, taking aim at Catherine. Swift Shadow reacted with astonishing speed, shoving Catherine against the canyon wall as a bullet struck the rock where she had been standing a split second before. In the same fluid motion, he drew his rifle and fired upward, forcing their attacker to duck for cover. "Run!" he commanded, pushing her ahead of him along the ledge. They fled downward as quickly as the treacherous footing allowed, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around them. More shouts from above indicated that others were joining the first attacker, converging on their position. The ledge they followed ended abruptly at a drop of about 15 feet to a wider shelf below. Without hesitation, Swift Shadow secured his rifle across his back and dropped to the lower level, landing in a crouch. He turned immediately, arms raised. "Jump!" he called to Catherine. "I catch you!" Catherine hesitated only briefly before bullets striking closer forced her decision. She launched herself into space, her heart in her throat, and felt Swift Shadow's strong arms catch her, absorbing the impact of her fall before setting her quickly on her feet. They continued their desperate flight, scrambling down increasingly steep terrain as their pursuers' shouts echoed behind them. Catherine's world narrowed to the few feet of ground ahead of her and the sound of Swift Shadow's breathing beside her. Nothing existed but the need to keep moving, to stay ahead of the death that followed. When they finally reached the canyon floor, Swift Shadow pulled her into a narrow side ravine, pressing her against the rock wall as he surveyed their surroundings. His breathing was controlled despite their exertion, but Catherine could feel the tension in him, a tightly coiled readiness. "How many?" she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "4, maybe 5, he replied, checking his rifle. "All behind. Us now." "What do we do?" Catherine asked, knowing they couldn't outrun mounted pursuers on open ground. Swift Shadow's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw genuine concern in their dark depths. "Must separate. You run for river. I lead them away." "No!" Catherine protested immediately. "They'll kill you." "Have better chance alone," he insisted. "Can move in ways they cannot follow. Draw them away from your path." "And what about me? Alone again, in the wilderness?" Swift Shadow reached into his shirt and withdrew a small object hung on a leather cord, a carving of what appeared to be a mountain lion, worn smooth by handling. "Take this," he said, placing it around her neck. "Protection spirit, gives courage." Catherine clutched the small carving, deeply moved by the gesture. "I can't leave you to face them alone. There has to be another way." Swift Shadow seemed about to argue further when a new sound reached them, hoofbeats, many of them, approaching rapidly. Both froze, listening intently. The riders were coming from the north, not from the direction of their pursuers. "The cavalry patrol," Catherine whispered. "They must have circled around. Swift Shadow's expression remained guarded. Or more of Reed's men. They pressed deeper into the ravine's shadows as the riders drew closer. Through a gap in the rocks, Catherine could see the canyon floor where a dozen cavalry soldiers had reined in their mounts, a sergeant apparently giving orders to spread out and search the area. One soldier, riding slightly apart from the others, caught her attention. There was something familiar about his bearing, the way he sat his horse. As he turned in their direction, Catherine gasped in recognition. "Lieutenant Michael Harrington," she breathed, hardly daring to believe her eyes. "You know this soldier?" Swift Shadow asked sharply. "Yes, he served under my father in the war. He was at our home many times in St. Louis." Catherine stepped forward, ready to reveal their presence, but Swift Shadow held her back. "Wait," he cautioned. "Be certain. Many men change when gold or power offered." Catherine hesitated, studying the lieutenant more carefully. Michael Harrington had been like an older brother to her during his visits to their home. Her father had trusted him implicitly, often saying Harrington was one of the few men with an unshakable moral compass. If anyone in the army could be trusted, it was him. "I'm certain," she said firmly. "Lieutenant Harrington is a good man." Before Swift Shadow could object further, Catherine stepped out from their hiding place and called out, "Lieutenant Harrington!" "Michael!" The reaction was immediate. Every soldier wheeled toward her voice, rifles raised, but Harrington pushed his horse forward, his expression changing from alert wariness to shocked recognition. "Miss Blackwood? Catherine?" He dismounted, quickly approaching with evident disbelief. "We thought you died in the attack." "I survived," Catherine said, emotion threatening to overwhelm her now that rescue seemed at hand. "But the men who did it are still after me. They're coming." She pointed toward the ridge they had descended. Harrington immediately signaled to his men, who took up defensive positions facing the indicated direction. "Get her to safety," he ordered a young corporal, who moved to escort Catherine toward the horses. Catherine stood her ground. "Wait, I'm not alone." She turned back toward the ravine. "Swift Shadow saved my life. He's been protecting me, helping me reach Fort Davis." Harrington's expression changed, wariness returning. "A Comanche? Here?" "Please," Catherine implored. "He could have left me to die many times. Instead, he risked everything to help me. The men who attacked the stagecoach, they've been raiding both settler and Comanche camps, trying to start a war." Harrington studied Catherine for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Years of military service had taught him to be suspicious of Comanche warriors, yet the earnestness in Catherine's plea was undeniable. He glanced toward the ravine where Swift Shadow remained hidden. "I give you my word as an officer that he will not be harmed if he comes out," Harrington called, his voice carrying authority even as it offered reassurance. There was a moment of tense silence before Swift Shadow emerged from the shadows, his movements fluid but cautious, his dark eyes assessing each soldier with the wariness of a wild creature surrounded by hunters. He stopped several paces from Catherine, his hand resting near, but not on, the knife at his belt. "This is Swift Shadow," Catherine said, stepping slightly closer to him in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on the watching soldiers. "Without him, I would have died in the canyon." Harrington approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "You have my gratitude for protecting Miss Blackwood," he said formally. "Judge Blackwood was a friend to many, including me." Swift Shadow inclined his head slightly, but remained silent, his gaze never leaving Harrington's face. The tense moment was interrupted by a shout from one of the soldiers positioned at the canyon's edge. "Riders coming, Lieutenant! 6 men!" "Moving fast. Reed's men," Catherine said urgently. "They've been hunting me since the attack." Harrington's decision was immediate. "Mount up, defensive positions!" He turned to Catherine and Swift Shadow. "We'll handle this. Stay back." Swift Shadow moved closer to Catherine as the soldiers formed a protective line across the canyon floor, Rifles ready. "Still not trust soldiers," he said quietly. "Too easy for ambush." Catherine understood his concern. "Lieutenant Harrington won't betray us," she insisted, though a seed of doubt had been planted. In this territory, where corruption seemed to reach into every institution, could she be certain of anyone's loyalty? The approaching riders came into view, slowing abruptly when they spotted the cavalry unit. There were 6 of them, hard-faced, men whose expressions shifted from predatory determination to calculated caution at the sight of the soldiers. A man Catherine recognized as one of the stagecoach attackers rode slightly ahead of the others. He raised a hand in casual greeting as he approached. "Afternoon, Lieutenant. Glad to see the army patrolling these parts. Been some troubling activity lately." "State your business, sir," Harrington replied coolly, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Name's Carter, working security for territorial land surveys." The man lied smoothly. "We're tracking a Comanche raider who attacked a survey camp 3 days back, killed 2 men, took a woman captive." His eyes shifted to Catherine, malice briefly visible before his mask of civility returned. "That appears to be her with you, and if I'm not mistaken, that's our Comanche." Catherine felt her blood run cold at the audacity of the lie. Swift Shadow tensed beside her, his hand now fully on his knife's handle. "That's not true." Catherine stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly despite her fear. "These men attacked a stagecoach 4 days ago. They murdered everyone, including Judge James Blackwood, who was traveling to Fort Davis on official business. I am his niece, Catherine Blackwood, and the only survivor." Carter's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The lady's confused, Lieutenant. Been through a traumatic experience with that savage. Stockholm Syndrome, the doctors call it." "She seems remarkably coherent to me," Harrington replied, his tone hardening. "And I know exactly who she is. The judge and I were well acquainted." A subtle shift occurred among Carter's men, hands moving closer to weapons, postures tensing for action. Harrington noticed it too, signaling his soldiers to remain alert. "Lieutenant," Catherine continued, sensing the situation balancing on a knife's edge, "these men work for Clayton Reed. They've been staging raids on both settlers and Comanche, camps to provoke conflict and justify seizing land." Carter's facade cracked slightly at the mention of Reed's name. "That's a serious accusation, miss. Mr. Reed is a respected businessman with close ties to the territorial governor." "Indeed he is," Harrington agreed, his expression unreadable, "which makes these allegations all the more concerning." He straightened in his saddle, his decision made. "I believe this matter requires a formal investigation. Mr. Carter, I'll need you and your men to surrender your weapons and accompany us to Fort Davis for questioning." The canyon fell silent as the standoff crystallized. Carter's eyes darted between the soldiers, calculating odds that were clearly not in his favor. For a moment, Catherine thought they might actually surrender. Then Carter's hand flashed to his pistol. "Now!" he shouted to his men. What followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides, echoing deafeningly off the canyon walls. Harrington's horse reared as a bullet struck near its hooves, nearly unseating him. Soldiers returned fire, 2 of Carter's men falling immediately from their saddles. Swift Shadow pulled Catherine behind a large boulder as bullets whizzed past them. "Stay down!" he ordered, reaching for his rifle. Catherine pressed herself against the rock, heart pounding in her ears. Through gaps between boulders, she could see the battle unfolding, soldiers taking cover, horses panicking, men falling. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with dust kicked up by scrambling boots and hooves. Carter had dismounted and taken position behind his fallen horse, firing methodically at the soldiers. His remaining men were doing the same, creating a deadly crossfire that had already claimed 1 young soldier who lay motionless on the canyon floor. Swift Shadow moved with purpose, circling behind the rocks to approach the battle from an angle. Carter's men weren't watching. Catherine wanted to call him back, to keep him safe beside her, but knew he was doing what he had trained his entire life to do: fight to protect what mattered. Lieutenant Harrington had established a defensive position behind a fallen log, directing his men with hand signals as they gradually gained the upper hand through superior numbers and discipline. 2 more of Carter's men were down, leaving only 3 still fighting. The battle might have ended there if not for a new development: the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the southern canyon entrance. Catherine's heart sank as she spotted at least a dozen more riders approaching rapidly. More of Reed's men, she whispered in despair. They would be overwhelmed, but as the riders drew closer, she realized they weren't mercenaries at all. They were Comanche warriors, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable against the late afternoon light. They swept into the canyon like a force of nature, war cries piercing the air as they joined the fray. The remaining attackers, now hopelessly outnumbered, attempted to flee, but were quickly cut off. Within minutes, the shooting had stopped entirely, replaced by an uneasy silence as Comanche warriors and army soldiers found themselves reluctant allies in the aftermath of battle. Swift shadow emerged from behind the rocks, approaching the leader of the Comanche band, a powerfully built man with a face deeply lined by sun and experience. They spoke rapidly in their native language, occasionally gesturing toward Catherine and the soldiers. Lieutenant Harrington cautiously approached, his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Who is in charge here?" he asked, addressing the Comanche leader directly. Swift Shadow translated, then relayed the answer. "This is Chief Grey Wolf of the Quahadi Band. He says these mountains have belonged to his people since before white men had names for them." Harrington nodded respectfully. "Please tell him I am Lieutenant Michael Harrington, and I thank him for his assistance against our common enemy." As Swift Shadow translated, Catherine emerged from her hiding place, moving to stand beside him. Her presence drew the chief's attention, his piercing gaze assessing her with unconcealed curiosity. "Ask him why they came," Catherine suggested to Swift Shadow. "How did they know to find us here?" The exchange that followed was brief but intense. Swift Shadow turned to Catherine with something like amazement in his usually stoic expression. "They were tracking me," he explained. "Chief Grey Wolf is my father's cousin. When I did not return from hunting, they followed my trail through canyon, found signs of the ambush, signs of you and me traveling together." "Your family?" Catherine breathed, understanding dawning. "They came looking for you." "Yes." For the first time, Swift Shadow seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "Did not expect this. Thought they would stay at summer camp until Moon Festival." Chief Grey Wolf spoke again, his tone commanding despite Catherine's inability to understand. The words, "He asks why army soldiers fight against Reed's men," Swift Shadow translated. "Wants to know if this is trick." Lieutenant Harrington, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "Please tell him that I serve justice, not corrupt. Men like Reed." Judge Blackwood was coming to investigate land fraud and treaty violations. These men killed him to prevent that investigation. As Swift Shadow translated, Catherine noticed Carter trying to inch away from where he sat wounded against a rock. Without hesitation, she drew her small derringer and aimed it at him. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You killed my uncle. You won't escape justice now." Carter froze, his eyes widening at the transformation in the woman he had hunted as helpless prey. The soldiers quickly secured him, binding his wounds before binding his hands. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity as the wounded were tended to and decisions made about how to proceed. Chief Grey Wolf and Lieutenant Harrington, with Swift Shadow translating, established an uneasy but functional alliance against their common enemy. Reed will have more men, Harrington explained to Catherine as they prepared to depart. We need to reach Fort Davis as quickly as possible with you and our prisoners. Your testimony, combined with what we've learned today, should be enough to convince the Territory Command to launch a full investigation. And if Reed has influence there too, Catherine asked, the question that had been troubling her since they'd encountered the soldiers. Harrington's expression hardened. Then we go higher, all the way to Washington if necessary. He glanced at the Comanche warriors who were preparing to depart on their own path. This territory can't afford a war based on lies and greed. Swift Shadow approached, leading 2 horses, one for himself and one for Catherine. The gesture wasn't lost on her. He intended to continue the journey with her, despite the presence of the army escort. "You're still coming?" she asked, surprised and touched by his commitment. "Promise to see you safely to Fort Davis," he replied simply. "Not there yet." Chief Grey Wolf called out to Swift Shadow, adding something that made the younger man straighten with evident pride. "What did he say?" Catherine asked as they mounted their horses. "Says I found good ally in unexpected place," Swift Shadow translated, his eyes meeting hers. "Says sometimes Great Spirit brings together different rivers to make stronger current against common enemy." The imagery resonated deeply with Catherine. They were indeed like 2 rivers from different mountains, converging against forces that threatened both their peoples. As their unusual procession began moving northward, cavalry soldiers, Comanche warriors maintaining a parallel but separate course, and prisoners under guard, she reflected on how far she had come from the terrified woman hiding in a canyon crevice just days ago. Lieutenant Harrington rode up beside them as they followed the canyon's winding path toward the river valley they had spotted earlier. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding Reed's operations," he said to Catherine. "If he's been orchestrating false raids, he must have a significant organization, men, supplies, information networks." "My uncle believed the corruption extended to several territorial officials," Catherine replied. "He had compiled evidence before leaving St. Louis, but wouldn't discuss details with me for my own safety." "Wise precaution," Harrington agreed grimly, "but it means that evidence is likely lost in the stagecoach attack." Swift Shadow, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Judge carried locked box? Small, made of metal?" Catherine turned to him in surprise. "Yes, he did. How did you know?" "Saw men searching wreckage, very interested in finding something. One man became angry, struck another when box not found." Hope flared in Catherine's chest. If they didn't find it, then it might still be there, at the massacre site. Harrington immediately grasped the significance. "If we could recover your uncle's evidence, combined with your testimony and what we've learned today." He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood that such evidence could be decisive in bringing Reed and his conspirators to justice. "Site is 2 days' ride south," Swift Shadow said, calculating. "Dangerous to return. Reed will have men watching." "I have to try," Catherine insisted. "My uncle died trying to expose this conspiracy. I can't let his work be in vain." Harrington considered their options. "I can't commit my full patrol to a search mission without authorization, but I could detach a small unit, 3 men, plus myself." "And me," Catherine added firmly. "I need to be there. I might recognize something the rest of you would overlook." "It's too dangerous," Harrington objected. "We should get you safely to Fort Davis first, and give Reed time to send more men to search the site," Catherine countered. "We might never have this opportunity again." Swift Shadow had been silent during this exchange, his expression thoughtful. Now he spoke with careful deliberation. "Chief Grey Wolf and warriors return to summer camp tomorrow. Path takes them near stage attack place. Could provide protection for small group searching." The suggestion was unexpected. Comanche warriors voluntarily escorting army soldiers was unprecedented in this territory. Harrington's surprise was evident, but he recovered quickly. Would Chief Grey Wolf consider such an arrangement? He asked. We'll ask, Swift Shadow replied, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer would be conditional at best. While Swift Shadow rode ahead to consult with the Comanche chief, Catherine and Harrington discussed the practicalities of their new plan. The main patrol would continue to Fort Davis with the prisoners, while a smaller group would detour to the stagecoach site in search of Judge Blackwood's evidence. I still think it's unnecessarily risky for you to come, Harrington said to Catherine as they rode, but I understand why you feel you must. Catherine appreciated his concern, but had no intention of being left behind. My uncle raised me to believe that justice requires courage, she said. Sometimes that means facing danger rather than hiding from it. When Swift Shadow returned, his news was mixed. Chief agrees to escort to Massacre site, but with conditions. Soldiers must be no more than 4, must follow Comanche lead in all things, must give word to speak truth of what happened here when returned to White Man's Fort. Harrington considered the terms, then nodded. Agreed. Please convey my thanks to the chief. As the sun began to set, turning the canyon walls to burnished copper, they made camp near a small spring. The soldiers and Comanche warriors maintained separate fires, the historical animosity between them too deep to be completely overcome by one afternoon's alliance. Yet there was a notable absence of hostility, a watchful truce rather than active tension. Catherine found herself sitting between two worlds, the military structure she had grown up with as an officer's daughter, and the more fluid, nature-attuned organization of the Comanche camp. Swift Shadow moved between both with practiced ease, though she noticed he seemed more relaxed among his own people. After a simple meal, Catherine approached the Comanche fire, conscious of curious eyes tracking her movement. She had requested Swift Shadow's assistance with a particular matter, and he now stood beside her as she faced Chief Grey Wolf. Tell him I wish to thank him and his warriors for their help today, Catherine began, and for agreeing to escort us to find my uncle's evidence. Swift Shadow translated, and the chief responded with a dignified nod. Encouraged, Catherine continued, I also wish to learn, she said, fingers touching the mountain lion carving that still hung around her neck, about your people's ways, your understanding of this land. If we are to find justice and peace, we must first find understanding. As Swift Shadow translated, she saw surprise register on several faces around the fire. The chief's weathered features remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted, a reassessment, perhaps even the faintest hint of approval. His response, when it came, was lengthy and delivered with the weight of authority. Swift Shadow listened intently before turning to Catherine. He says learning begins with listening, not just with ears, but with heart. Says few white people truly listen to Comanche voice. Swift Shadow paused, seeming to consider how to translate the next portion. Says woman who survives canyon alone, who fights beside Comanche instead of against, who carries protection spirit with respect. This woman might have ears that truly hear. Catherine bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the conditional acceptance being offered. Tell him I am ready to listen. What followed was an evening unlike any Catherine had experienced. As the stars emerged in brilliant clarity above the canyon, Chief Grey Wolf and the tribal elders shared stories of the land's creation, of the Comanche's history, of the spirit world that existed alongside the physical one. Swift Shadow translated, tirelessly occasionally adding his own insights when cultural concepts proved difficult to convey in English. The stories were not simply entertainment. They contained practical knowledge, ethical guidelines, and warnings about the consequences of disrupting natural and spiritual balances. Catherine realized she was being granted a rare privilege, insight into a worldview that most settlers never glimpsed, much less tried to understand. Lieutenant Harrington joined them partway through the evening, sitting quietly at the edge of the firelight. His presence was tolerated rather than welcomed by most of the Comanche, but Chief Gray, Wolf acknowledged him with a respectful nod. When the storytelling concluded, the chief addressed Catherine directly, waiting for Swift Shadow to translate. "He asks what you will do if you find your uncle's evidence," Swift Shadow relayed, "if Reed and his men are punished by white man's law." It was a question Catherine had been pondering herself. "Justice for my uncle is only the beginning," she replied carefully. "The true justice would be peace between our peoples, recognition of Comanche rights to their traditional lands, and an end to the corruption that threatens both settlers and native people." As Swift Shadow translated, she saw skepticism on many faces. Such ideals had been voiced before, only to be broken when gold or land or political expedience demanded it. "Tell them I cannot promise what the government will do," she added, acknowledging the reality they all understood. "But I can promise what I will do, speak the truth, no matter who it offends, and work to ensure that treaties are honored." Chief Grey Wolf studied her for a long moment after hearing the translation. Then he spoke briefly, rising to indicate the conversation was concluded. The other Comanche followed suit, moving away to their sleeping areas with measured dignity. "What did he say?" Catherine asked Swift Shadow as they walked back toward the soldiers' camp. "Said truth is like sunrise, cannot be stopped by man's wishes once it begins to appear." Swift Shadow's expression was thoughtful. "Also said tomorrow brings its own challenges, should rest now." Catherine nodded, feeling the weight of the day's events in every muscle. As they reached her designated sleeping area, a small space, near the soldiers' fire but slightly apart for propriety's sake, she turned to Swift Shadow. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He inclined his head slightly, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. "Sleep well, Catherine Blackwood. Tomorrow we return to where your journey began." As he walked away toward the Comanche camp, Catherine settled onto her borrowed bedroll, gazing up at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly above the canyon walls. Tomorrow they would return to the site of the massacre to confront both physical evidence and painful memories. She touched the mountain lion carving at her throat, drawing comfort from its smooth contours and the connection it represented. Between two worlds, between justice and vengeance, between the past she had lost and the future she had yet to find. Catherine Blackwood closed her eyes and surrendered to exhaustion, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it. With newfound strength and unexpected allies, dawn broke with a clarity that painted the canyon in shades of amber and rose. Catherine woke instantly, the soldier's daughter in her responding to the subtle changes in the camp around her. Men checking weapons, horses being readied, quiet conversations about the day's mission. For a moment, the familiar routine almost made her forget the extraordinary circumstances that had brought her here. Almost. The ache in her muscles and the lingering rawness of her healing feet were vivid reminders of her ordeal. Yet Catherine was surprised to realize that she felt stronger this morning than she had in days, as if her body were finally catching up to the resilience her spirit had discovered in the wilderness. Lieutenant Harrington approached as she was rolling up her borrowed bedding. "We're nearly ready to depart," he said, his military efficiency tempered by genuine concern. "Are you certain you're up to this? It won't be easy returning to the site." Catherine appreciated his consideration, but would not be deterred. "Some journeys require us to revisit our darkest moments before we can move forward," she replied, securing her sparse belongings. "My uncle taught me that justice often demands difficult paths." Harrington nodded, respecting her determination. "Your uncle was a wise man. I only met him a few times after the war, but his reputation for integrity was unmatched." He glanced toward the Comanche camp, where similar preparations were underway. "Our unusual alliance is set. Chief Grey Wolf will lead us by a route his scouts believe will avoid Reed's patrols." "And Swift Shadow?" Catherine asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "He'll ride with us," Harrington replied, a hint of something understanding, perhaps, in his expression. "He knows the site, and the chief seems to trust his judgment with diplomatic matters." The implication that she might be among those diplomatic matters wasn't lost on Catherine, but she chose not to address it. Her relationship with Swift Shadow, whatever it might be called, was too new, too undefined to withstand outside scrutiny. Within the hour, their small party was assembled and ready to depart. Lieutenant Harrington had selected 3 of his most experienced soldiers to accompany them: Sergeant Miller, a weathered veteran with a grey-streaked beard, Corporal Dawson, young but steady, and Private Jenkins, who Harrington had mentioned, was part Cherokee and might help bridge cultural gaps. Chief Grey Wolf had brought 5 warriors, each mounted on the small, agile horses the Comanche were famous for breeding. They carried minimal supplies but were heavily armed: bows, lances, and a few rifles acquired through trade or battle. Swift Shadow rode between the 2 groups, physically embodying the bridge he had become. He wore a mixture of traditional Comanche attire and practical items acquired from settler culture: buckskin leggings and shirt, but also a wide-brimmed hat against the sun, and a cavalry-style canteen at his belt. 3 hours to Massacre Place, he informed Catherine as they set out, the combined party moving in a loose formation through the gradually widening canyon. "Path is hidden, but faster than where you walked." They rode southwest, following game trails and ancient pathways known only to the Comanche. The landscape changed subtly as they traveled, the towering canyon walls giving way to rolling hills, covered in scrub brush and occasional stands of juniper. The April sun climbed higher, bringing warmth that was still pleasant before summer's punishing heat would claim the land. Catherine found herself riding beside Swift Shadow for much of the morning, their conversation flowing more easily than she would have expected. He pointed out plants with medicinal properties, explained how certain rock formations served as landmarks, and identified animal tracks with a precision that transformed the seemingly empty landscape into a text she was slowly learning to read. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" she asked, during a brief stop to rest the horses. Swift Shadow adjusted his hat against the sun before answering. "When 12 summers old, Quaker mission took me, said would teach civilized ways." His expression remained neutral, but Catherine sensed buried memories beneath the simple statement. "Stayed 3 winters, learned reading, writing, white man's God." "And then you returned to your people?" "Yes. Comanche ways are my blood, but white man's words useful for understanding enemy." He glanced at her, something softening in his usually guarded expression, or sometimes finding ally. Before Catherine could respond, one of the Comanche scouts returned at a gallop, reporting urgently to Chief Grey Wolf. The chief's expression darkened as he listened, and he immediately signaled for the party to move into a nearby ravine for uncover. "What is it?" Harrington asked as they concealed themselves among the rocks and brush. Swift Shadow conferred briefly with the scout before answering. "Riders ahead. 6 men, heavily armed, watching stage road." "Reed's men," Catherine said, her stomach tightening with renewed fear. "Most likely," Harrington agreed grimly. "They must have established patrols near the attack site, in case anyone returns." Chief Grey Wolf spoke at length, gesturing toward a ridge to their west. Swift Shadow translated, "Chief says we cannot approach directly now. Must circle wide, come from direction they do not watch. Will take longer." "How much longer?" Catherine asked. thinking of the evidence they sought and the growing possibility that Reed's men might find it first. Reach sight by sunset instead. Of midday, Swift Shadow replied. Wait until dark to search. The plan was sound, if frustrating. None of them relished the idea of delaying their mission, but a direct confrontation with Reed's patrol would jeopardize everything they hoped to accomplish. They altered course, following a winding path through rough country that took them miles out of their way. The detour required traversing terrain that would have been impassable without the Comanche guides. Narrow defiles between stone formations, dry stream beds that provided concealment, paths along ridgelines where vigilant eyes could spot danger before it spotted them. Throughout the journey, Catherine was struck by the seamless coordination between the Comanche warriors. They communicated with subtle gestures and signals, anticipating needs and sharing information without need for discussion. It was a stark contrast to the more regimented but less intuitive organization of the soldiers. By late afternoon, they had circled around to approach the massacre site from the east, the opposite direction from where Reed's patrol had been spotted. They made camp in a sheltered depression about a mile from their destination, concealing horses and equipment with practiced efficiency. As twilight deepened toward night, the group gathered to finalize their plan. The stagecoach wreckage lay in a small clearing surrounded by mesquite and scrub oak, a location chosen by the ambushers for both visibility and multiple escape routes. We'll approach in 2 groups, Harrington decided, after consulting with Chief Greywolf through Swift Shadow's translation. The Comanche warriors will establish a perimeter to warn of any approaching threats. My men and I will secure the immediate area around the site. And I'll search for my uncle's strongbox, Catherine added, her determination evident, despite the apprehension she felt at returning to the scene of such horror. Swift Shadow spoke up. I go with Catherine. Know what men were looking for. Where? They searched already. No one objected to this arrangement. As they made final preparations, checking weapons, donning darker clothing for concealment, reviewing signals, Catherine found herself withdrawing slightly from the activity, her mind increasingly focused on what awaited them. Swift Shadow noticed her silence. Difficult to return, he said quietly, approaching where she sat slightly apart from the others. Place of great fear again. Catherine nodded, grateful for his perception. It's not just fear, she admitted. It's, I'll be seeing where my uncle died, where everyone died, while I survived. She looked up at him, struggling to articulate the complex emotions churning within her. Why did I survive when they didn't? Swift Shadow considered her question with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing to offer empty consolation. Old ones say life chooses some for special purpose, he finally replied. Not because more worthy, but because necessary for what comes next. What purpose could possibly justify such loss? Catherine asked, the question that had haunted her since the attack. Justice, he answered simply. Truth, change. His dark eyes held hers steadily. One survivor who speaks truth can change more than many who die silent. The profound simplicity of his answer resonated deeply. Catherine had been focusing on why she had survived rather than what she might do with that survival. The shift in perspective didn't erase her grief or guilt, but it offered a path forward, a purpose that honored those who had been lost. "Thank you," she said softly, touching the mountain lion carving that still hung at her throat, "for seeing more in me than just someone to be rescued." Swift Shadow's expression remained serious, but something warmed in his eyes. Sea warrior, spirit awakening, like mountain cat who learns its own strength. Their quiet exchange was interrupted by Lieutenant Harrington's approach. "It's time," he said, his voice low. "The moon set, and we have optimal darkness for the approach." They moved out in prearranged formation, utilizing the skills of both cultures, Comanche stealth and army precision, to advance through the darkness toward the massacre site. The night had grown cool, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of desert sage and distant rain that would likely never reach this parched land. As they drew closer, Catherine's heart began to pound painfully against her ribs. Memories threatened to overwhelm her, the crack of rifles, screams cut short, the metallic smell of blood mixing with gunpowder. She forced herself to focus on her breathing, on the solid presence of Swift Shadow moving silently beside her, on the mission that gave meaning to her survival. The stagecoach came into view, a darker shadow against the star-scattered sky. It lay on its side, one wheel missing, the roof partially collapsed from the impact when the panicked horses had veered off the trail during the attack. Around it, the shadows marked where bodies had fallen, now removed, presumably, by the army patrol that had investigated the site days after the attack. The Comanche warriors disappeared into the darkness to establish their watchful perimeter, while Harrington and his men secured the immediate area around the wreckage. Catherine and Swift Shadow approached the overturned stagecoach cautiously, every sense alert for signs of danger or disturbance. "Where did you last see the strong box?" Swift Shadow asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Catherine moved carefully, around the wreckage, orienting herself. "My uncle kept it under his seat, here." She indicated a section of the coach now exposed to the sky due to its position on its side. It was secured with a special lock to the frame of the coach itself. Swift Shadow examined the area she indicated, using touch more than sight in the darkness. "Metal cut," he reported, fingers tracing the edge of what had once been a mounting bracket. "Someone removed with tools." Catherine's heart sank. Reed's men must have found it after all. "Maybe." Swift Shadow continued his methodical examination of the wreckage. "But strange. If found box, why keep watching site? Why patrol nearby still?" It was a valid question. If Reed's men had already recovered the evidence, there would be no reason to maintain surveillance of the area. "They haven't found it," Catherine realized, hope rekindling. "They know it's valuable, know it was here, but haven't located it yet." Swift Shadow nodded. "Judge hid it elsewhere, not under seat where expected." Catherine thought back to their journey, trying to recall any moment when her uncle might have moved the strongbox. "He was very protective of it," she said slowly. "Never let it out of his sight during stops, even slept with it beside him at the stations." A memory surfaced, her uncle speaking quietly with the stagecoach driver the morning of the attack, both men glancing around as if ensuring they weren't overheard. At the time, she had thought nothing of it, assuming it was merely discussion of the day's journey. "The driver," she said suddenly, "Samuel Weathers. He was a former army courier. Uncle trusted him, I think. I think he might have given the box to Samuel to conceal somewhere on the coach, somewhere less obvious than his own seat." They expanded their search, examining every possible hiding place in and around the shattered vehicle. Lieutenant Harrington joined them, bringing a carefully shielded lantern that provided just enough light to work by without risking detection from a distance. "The driver's box," Harrington suggested, indicating the small compartment beneath. "The driver's seat where mail and valuables were sometimes transported. It might have a false bottom or concealed compartment." The driver's box was damaged but intact, still attached to the front section of the coach. Swift Shadow examined it carefully, his sensitive fingers detecting what eyes could not in the limited light. "Here," he said finally, pressing a barely perceptible seam along one side of the box. There was a soft click, and a narrow panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Within lay a small iron strongbox, no larger than a lady's writing case, but considerably heavier. It bore the Blackwood family crest on its lid and was secured with an intricate lock that had clearly defeated previous attempts to open it. There were scratch marks around the keyhole where someone had tried and failed to pick it. "Uncle always kept the key on his watch chain," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion as she withdrew the pocket watch she had recovered days earlier. The key was still attached, small but distinctive, with a uniquely shaped bit. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key into the lock. For a moment she hesitated, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. This box contained the evidence her uncle had died protecting, evidence that might bring justice not only for him, but for countless others harmed by Reed's conspiracy. Swift Shadow's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of support and understanding. "Your uncle's voice waits to be heard," he said quietly. Catherine nodded, drew a steadying breath, and turned the key. The lock mechanism released with a satisfying click, and she lifted the lid. Inside were several items: a leather-bound journal filled with her uncle's meticulous handwriting, a packet of letters tied with legal ribbon, several official-looking documents bearing territorial seals, and a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be land deeds. Lieutenant Harrington examined one of the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. "Your uncle was thorough," he said finally. "He's documented a systematic conspiracy involving territorial officials, land speculators, and certain army officers. Reed appears to be the primary orchestrator, but there are significant names implicated here, including Assistant Territorial Governor Haskell." "That explains the resources at Reed's disposal," Catherine said, "the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear, and why they were so desperate to silence my uncle." Swift Shadow had been examining the journal. Though his reading skills were limited, he recognized a map drawn on one page. "This shows Comanche hunting grounds," he said, pointing to areas marked with distinctive symbols. "And here, places where attacks happened, both Comanche villages and white settlements." Harrington studied the map with growing understanding. "Your uncle was mapping the pattern of the raids. They weren't random. They specifically targeted areas where land claims were contested or where resource rights were in dispute, creating a conflict that would justify military intervention," Catherine concluded, "and allow Reed and his associates to acquire the land at a fraction of its value once both settlers and Comanche had been driven out or killed." The enormity of the scheme was staggering. Not just isolated acts of violence for immediate profit, but a calculated campaign designed to manipulate territorial politics, military policy, and ultimately the fate of both settlers and indigenous peoples across the region. Their grim realization was interrupted by a low whistle from the perimeter, the warning signal they had established with the Comanche scouts. Someone was approaching. Hurriedly, they secured the documents back in the strongbox. Harrington extinguished the lantern, while Swift Shadow led Catherine to a defensible position behind the overturned stagecoach. Around them, soldiers and Comanche warriors melted into the shadows, weapons ready. For several tense minutes, they waited in complete silence. Then came the distinctive sound of horses approaching at a walk, not a normal patrol pace, but the cautious advance of men expecting potential trouble. "At least 4 riders," Swift Shadow whispered, his acute hearing picking up nuances Catherine missed. "Coming from west." Harrington signaled his men to hold position. In the starlight, Catherine could just make out the silhouettes of the approaching riders as they entered the clearing. They were indeed Reed's men. She recognized 2 of them from the stagecoach attack. They dismounted, one remaining with the horses, while 3 others began methodically searching the wreckage. Clearly not their first visit to the site, but conducted with renewed urgency that suggested they were running out of time to find what they sought. "We know the box is here somewhere," one man growled in frustration. "Reed's offering an extra 100 to whoever finds it." Maybe the Comanche took it, another suggested. Or that girl, if she survived like Carter claimed. Carter's a fool, the first man spat. If she survived, she's long dead in the wilderness by now. No city girl lasts out here alone. Catherine felt a surge of fierce satisfaction at their underestimation, coupled with renewed determination to prove them catastrophically wrong. She glanced at Swift Shadow, who had silently nocked an arrow to his bow, waiting for Harrington's signal. The lieutenant had positioned his men for maximum tactical advantage. With a subtle hand gesture, he indicated his intent: take them alive, if possible for the additional testimony they could provide. The signal came, a cupped hand suddenly opened. In the next instant, the night erupted with coordinated action. 2 Comanche warriors disabled one man with bolus that entangled his legs, bringing him down hard. Sergeant Miller and Corporal Dawson emerged from concealment directly behind 2 others, pressing pistols to their backs with commands to freeze. The 4th man, still by the horses, reacted with unexpected speed, drawing his weapon and firing toward the soldiers. His shot went wide, but it shattered the element of surprise. The clearing exploded into chaotic movement as the captured men attempted to break free, and their companion fired again, more deliberately this time. Private Jenkins cried out, clutching his arm where the bullet had grazed him. The shooter turned to fire at Harrington next, but never completed the action. Swift Shadow's arrow caught him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and causing him to drop his pistol. Within moments, all 4 of Reed's men had been subdued and disarmed. They glared with a mixture of hatred and fear as they were bound and forced to kneel in a line before Harrington. "Gentlemen," the lieutenant said with cold formality, "you are under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and various other charges. I'm certain the territorial court will enumerate in detail." One of the men, a hard-faced individual with a scar across his chin, laughed harshly. "You're a long way from any court, Lieutenant, and you're a fool if you think Reed doesn't have men in every judge's pocket from here to Santa Fe." Harrington smiled thinly. "Perhaps, but I doubt his influence extends all the way to the Federal Circuit Court in Denver, where Judge Morrison happens to be a personal friend of the late Judge Blackwood." He gestured to Catherine, who stepped forward with the strongbox. "And with this evidence, plus the testimony of the judge's niece, who survived your attack, I believe we have more than enough to ensure justice is served at the highest levels." The man's bravado faltered as he registered Catherine's presence. "You're supposed to be dead," he muttered, recognition and fear mixing in his expression. "Disappointed?" Catherine asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "I survived to ensure that what happened here doesn't remain buried in this desert. My uncle's voice will be heard, and you will answer for what you've done." As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they prepared to depart. The prisoners were secured on their own horses, hands bound to their saddles. Private Jenkins' wound had been treated, superficial but painful, and the strongbox was safely stowed in Harrington's saddlebags. Before mounting, Catherine walked once around the stagecoach wreckage, saying a silent farewell to her uncle and the others who had died there. It was not closure, that would come only with justice, but it was an acknowledgement of the journey that had brought her to this moment and the purpose that would carry her forward. Swift Shadow approached as she completed her circuit, respecting her grief with silence. When she finally looked up at him, he offered a simple observation. "Sun rises on new day." "Yes," Catherine agreed, seeing the symbolism in the golden light now spilling across the landscape, transforming the scene of tragedy into something almost beautiful. "And we carry the truth into it." Their unusual procession departed as the first full rays of sunlight touched the wreckage behind them. Catherine rode between worlds, Comanche warriors ahead, army soldiers behind, and Swift Shadow beside her. The strongbox with its crucial evidence was secure, the men who had attacked her captured, and their destination, Fort Davis, lay a day's journey ahead. Yet Catherine knew that reaching the fort was only the beginning of a longer journey toward justice. Reed remained free, his network of corruption still in place, and the tensions between settlers and indigenous peoples would not be easily resolved, even with evidence of manipulation exposed. As if reading her thoughts, Swift Shadow spoke. "Many rivers to cross still," he said, glancing at her with understanding in his usually guarded expression, "but now have map to follow, and unexpected allies to travel with," Catherine added, grateful for the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. They rode toward a future neither could have imagined days earlier, a judge's niece and a Comanche tracker, united by survival and a shared commitment to truth. The path ahead would not be easy, but as the morning sun warmed their faces and the distant silhouette of mountains beckoned on the horizon, Catherine Blackwood felt something she had thought lost. Forever in the canyon's shadows, hope. Fort Davis rose from the plains like a promise of civilization, its stone and adobe walls gleaming golden in the late afternoon sun. For Catherine, who had spent days in the wilderness fighting for survival, the sight of the American flag snapping in the breeze above the parade ground stirred unexpected emotion. Their approach did not go unnoticed. Sentries called out alerts, and by the time their unusual procession reached the main gate, a reception committee had assembled, a mix of curious onlookers and official representatives, including a stern-faced major whose insignia identified him as the fort's commanding officer. "Lieutenant Harrington," the major acknowledged, his gaze sweeping over the Comanche warriors who had escorted them, the bound prisoners, and finally resting on Catherine with undisguised surprise. "I see you've brought us quite a situation." "Major Wilson," Harrington saluted crisply, "I have the honor to present Miss Catherine Blackwood, niece of Judge James Blackwood. She is the sole survivor of the Silverline stage attack and a witness to crimes of the gravest nature." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers and civilians. The massacre had been the talk of the territory for days, with most assuming there had been no survivors. "Miss Blackwood." The major's tone softened slightly as he addressed her directly. "We had feared the worst. Your uncle was expected here on official business." "That official business is why he was murdered, Major," Catherine replied, her voice stronger than she had expected, "and why I've come to ensure his mission is completed." Within the hour, they were settled in the fort's headquarters building, a modest but functional structure housing the command offices and meeting rooms. Catherine had been provided with fresh clothing borrowed from the quartermaster's wife, and though the dress was ill-fitting, the simple act of changing out of her travel-worn garments had restored a measure of her former self. The Comanche warriors, including Chief Greywolf, had declined to enter the fort itself, choosing instead to make camp in a cottonwood grove half a mile distant. Their wariness of the military installation was understandable, given the history between their people and the U.S. Army. Only Swift Shadow had accompanied them inside, his presence a silent reminder of the unusual alliance that had brought them to this moment. In the commandant's office, Major Wilson listened with increasing gravity as Catherine recounted the events of the past week. The stagecoach ambush, her survival in the canyon, Swift Shadow's intervention, their discovery of the conspiracy, and the recovery of Judge Blackwood's evidence. Lieutenant Harrington contributed his own observations, particularly regarding the capture of Reed's men and their implied connections to territorial officials. When they had finished, Major Wilson sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the implications of their report. "This is unprecedented," he said finally, the word clearly insufficient for the scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. "Your uncle's evidence implicates not just this man Reed, but several officials I've dealt with personally, including the assistant territorial governor." "The evidence speaks for itself, sir," Harrington said, gesturing to the strongbox that now sat open on the Major's desk, its contents carefully arranged for review. Judge Blackwood documented everything methodically: dates, locations, financial transactions, even transcripts of conversations he witnessed. Major Wilson picked up one of the documents, a land deed with suspicious alterations to its boundary descriptions. "And you believe this is why he was targeted? To prevent this evidence from reaching Fort Davis?" "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "My uncle was coming here to meet with federal investigators. He mentioned a Justice Department representative would be arriving the same week." The Major's expression shifted subtly. "Marshal Thornton, he arrived 3 days ago, has been asking about the judge's whereabouts with increasing concern." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. At the Major's acknowledgement, a young lieutenant entered and saluted. "Sir, Marshal Thornton requests to join your meeting. He's heard about the arrival of Miss Blackwood." "Send him in," Wilson ordered, gathering the documents into more orderly piles. United States Marshal Edward Thornton proved to be a compact, energetic man whose unassuming appearance belied the shrewd intelligence in his eyes. He introduced himself courteously to Catherine before turning his full attention to the evidence spread across the desk. "Judge Blackwood contacted the Justice Department 2 months ago," he explained, as he examined the documents with practiced efficiency. "His initial report suggested widespread corruption in territorial land management, but he indicated he needed more concrete evidence before formal charges could be pursued." Thornton looked up, his expression somber. He was a good man. One of the few incorruptible judges in the Western Territories. "He was more than that to me," Catherine said quietly. "But I know he would consider it his finest legacy if his work brought this conspiracy to justice." "And so it shall," Thornton assured her, lifting the journal with its detailed map of targeted settlements. "This alone provides the pattern. We needed to establish intentionality rather than random violence." He turned to Swift Shadow, who had remained a silent observer by the wall. "And your people's testimony regarding the false raids will be invaluable." Swift Shadow straightened slightly, surprised at being directly addressed as a witness rather than a suspect. "Quahadi suffered 3 attacks where raiders left white man's items behind," he said carefully. "Chief Grey Wolf can tell of more from other bands." "I'll need to speak with him," Thornton said. "Would you be willing to act as translator? This investigation will require cooperation across communities that rarely speak to each other." The request acknowledged Swift Shadow's unique position between worlds, a role that had once isolated him but now made him essential to the pursuit of justice. He nodded once, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "What about Reed?" Catherine asked, returning to their most immediate concern. "He's still free, and his reach clearly extends throughout the territory." Thornton's expression hardened. "Clayton Reed is currently in Santa Fe, meeting with territorial investors. Based on this evidence, I can issue warrants for his arrest, and that of his closest associates immediately." He gathered the most incriminating documents into a separate pile. "With your testimony, Miss Blackwood, and these records, we can ensure they never threaten another settlement or indigenous community again." The meeting continued late into the evening, with Thornton meticulously documenting each piece of evidence and taking formal statements from all involved. By the time they concluded, a comprehensive picture of Reed's operation had emerged, a network of corruption extending from land offices to territorial governance, with tentacles reaching into military contracts and Indian affairs. As Catherine finally retired to the quarters arranged for her, the unused home of an officer currently serving in Arizona, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. The past week had demanded more of her than she had known she possessed, and now that safety had been achieved, her body seemed determined to claim its due rest. Yet sleep proved elusive. The soft bed felt strangely uncomfortable after nights on the hard ground, and the walls around her, though offering protection, seemed to close in with an oppressive stillness that the open canyon had never imposed. Most of all, her mind remained active, processing all that had occurred and contemplating what still lay ahead. A soft knock on her door roused her from her thoughts. Opening it cautiously, she found Swift Shadow standing outside, his tall figure silhouetted against the starlit parade ground beyond. "You should be resting," he said, noting her drawn expression. "As should you," she countered, observing the same fatigue in the lines around his eyes. "Why are you here so late?" "Leaving at dawn," he replied simply. "Came to say this." The announcement shouldn't have surprised her, yet Catherine felt something sink within her at his words. Of course, he would return to his people now that their shared mission was accomplished. What had she expected? "I understand," she said carefully, masking her disappointment. "You've done more than anyone could have asked already. Your people will be waiting for news." Swift Shadow studied her face in the dim light spilling from the oil lamp behind her. "You will stay here? Help Marshal with Justice Hunt?" "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "I need to see this through. For my uncle, for myself. Marshal Thornton says my testimony will be crucial in the federal proceedings." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken things that neither seemed ready to articulate. Finally, Swift Shadow reached into the pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "For you," he said, offering it to her. Catherine accepted the gift, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a beautifully crafted bracelet of intricately woven horsehair and small, polished stones that caught the lamplight. "It's beautiful," she said softly, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Comanche women wear to show courage," Swift Shadow explained. "Each stone for a brave deed." He pointed to the 7 stones incorporated into the design. "Chief Grey Wolf directed Singing Bird to make this for Canyon Woman who speaks truth." "Singing Bird?" "My sister's daughter," he clarified. "Has gift for making beauty from simple things." Catherine slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, moved by the acceptance it represented. "Thank you. I'll wear it with honor." Swift Shadow nodded, seeming satisfied. He turned to leave, then paused, adding almost as an afterthought, "We'll return when moon is full again. Bring news from Comanche Council about peace talk Marshal requests." The simple statement, a promise to return, lightened something in Catherine's heart. "I'll be here," she assured him. "There is much work to be done between our peoples." After he departed, Catherine returned to her bed and found that sleep came more easily. The bracelet remained on her wrist, a tangible connection to everything she had experienced and the bridge she was helping to build between 2 worlds that had too long viewed each other only through the lens of conflict. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Marshal Thornton had moved with impressive efficiency, securing warrants and dispatching deputies to arrest key members of Reed's network. Clayton Reed himself had been apprehended in Santa Fe, reportedly expressing shock that his operation had been exposed by the very woman he had ordered killed in the stagecoach attack. Catherine found herself immersed in legal matters, spending hours with Thornton and his team, clarifying details from her uncle's notes and providing her own eyewitness testimony. The federal prosecutor who arrived from Denver treated her with a respect that acknowledged her crucial role in the case, despite the prevailing attitudes toward women's involvement in legal proceedings. Yet amid these official duties, Catherine's thoughts often returned to the canyon, to the harsh lessons of survival she had learned there, and to the unexpected ally who had shown her a different way of seeing the world around her. She found herself watching the moon each night, tracking its progression toward fullness. True to his word, Swift Shadow returned exactly 1 month after their parting. Catherine was in the small office Major Wilson had allocated for her use when a corporal knocked at her door. "Ma'am, there's an Indian asking for you at the gate," the young soldier reported, clearly uncertain about the protocol for such a situation. Catherine suppressed a smile at his discomfort. "Thank you, Corporal. Please inform the gate that Swift Shadow is expected and should be escorted to headquarters immediately." The soldier blinked in surprise at her ready identification of the visitor, but saluted and departed to relay her instructions. 20 minutes later, Swift Shadow entered her office, his appearance markedly different from when she had last seen him. He wore a mixture of traditional and Western clothing, buckskin leggings with a cotton shirt, his hair still worn long but neatly tied back. Most notably, he carried himself with a new confidence in these surroundings, less the wary outsider and more a man conducting official business. "Catherine Blackwood," he greeted her formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the stiffness of his address. "Swift Shadow," she returned, equally formal despite the smile that tugged at her lips. "You honor us with your presence." The artificial formality dissolved as they both recognized its absurdity after all they had shared. Catherine gestured to a chair, and they settled into a more comfortable conversation about the developments of the past month. "Chief Grey Wolf has spoken with Council of Elders," Swift Shadow reported. "Agreed to meet with Marshal Thornton and Army chiefs to discuss new peace understanding. Not treaty," he clarified, "but beginning of honest words between peoples." "That's remarkable progress," Catherine said, genuinely impressed. "Marshal Thornton will be eager to arrange the meeting." "Already arranged," Swift Shadow replied, with quiet pride. 3 days from now, at Neutral Place, trading post at Broken Arrow Creek. Chief asked me to be voice between languages." Catherine noted how naturally he had assumed this crucial diplomatic role, a bridge between cultures that had once seemed unbridgeable. "You'll be excellent in that position," she said sincerely. "You understand both worlds in ways few others do." A hint of something, perhaps embarrassment at her praise, crossed his features before he redirected the conversation. "And Reed? His men?" "In federal custody, awaiting trial in Denver," Catherine reported. "Marshal Thornton didn't trust the territorial courts to remain impartial. The evidence is overwhelming. They've already secured testimony from several accomplices seeking leniency." Swift Shadow nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Justice finds its path, like water through stone, slow sometimes but persistent." The observation reminded Catherine of her uncle's similar belief in the inevitable triumph of justice when pursued with determination. "My uncle would have appreciated that perspective," she said softly. Their conversation continued as afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the parade ground outside. Swift Shadow shared news of his people, the band's movement to summer hunting grounds, the recovery of families affected by the false raids, the cautious optimism among some elders that genuine understanding might be possible. Catherine, in turn, told him of the broader impact of their discoveries. The territorial governor had been forced to resign. Several land office officials were under investigation. Military policies regarding response to reported raids were being reviewed with new scrutiny toward verification before action. "Small changes," Swift Shadow observed, "but seeds grow when planted in prepared ground." As evening approached, Catherine realized their meeting had extended far longer than either had likely anticipated. "You'll need quarters for the night," she said, rising to make arrangements. "I'm sure Major Wilson can—" "Stay with my people," Swift Shadow interrupted gently. "Camp outside Fort Still, more comfortable there." Of course, despite his ease in navigating the fort today, he would naturally prefer the company of his own people to the confined quarters within military walls. Catherine nodded, understanding. "But tomorrow," he continued, "thought you might ride with me to Broken Arrow Creek. See meeting place before others arrive." Marshal Thornton says your voice important at peace talk, too." The invitation surprised and pleased her. "I'd like that very much," she replied, already anticipating the freedom of being beyond the fort's walls again. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for their excursion to Broken Arrow Creek. Catherine wore a split riding skirt borrowed from the Major's wife, practical attire that acknowledged her new reality as a woman who moved between the structured world of territorial governance and the open spaces beyond. Swift Shadow waited at the gate with 2 horses, his own mount and a gentle bay mare for Catherine. They departed with minimal ceremony. Though Catherine noted the respectful nods several soldiers offered to Swift Shadow, a marked change from the suspicious glances that would have been his reception a month earlier. Once beyond the immediate vicinity of the fort, they fell into an easy, traveling rhythm. The weather remained pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers that had bloomed after recent rains. Catherine found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since returning to civilization, the open landscape around them offering a sense of freedom that walls and protocols could never provide. "You seem more yourself here," Swift Shadow observed as they paused to water the horses at a small stream. Catherine smiled, not surprised by his perception. "I didn't realize how confined I've felt until now," she admitted. "Which is strange, because logically, I'm safer at the fort than I was in the canyon." "Not strange," he countered. "In canyon, found your true strength. In fort, others see only what they expect to see. Judge's niece, proper lady, witness to protect." His insight struck her with the force of recognition. She had indeed been slipping back into roles defined by others' expectations, the bereaved niece, the valuable witness, the respectable lady in need of protection. None of these roles acknowledged the woman who had survived alone in the wilderness, who had faced killers with courage, who had bridged cultural divides that had separated communities for generations. "You're right," she said, a new resolve forming within her. "I need to remember who I discovered myself to be out there." Swift Shadow nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Canyon woman still here," he said, tapping her shoulder lightly. "Just sleeping sometimes." They continued their journey, reaching Broken Arrow Creek by midday. The trading post was a modest establishment, a low adobe building with attached stables, situated at the junction of 2 well-traveled routes. Its neutral reputation among both settlers and indigenous peoples made it an ideal location for the unprecedented peace discussions to come. The proprietor, a weathered man named Jacobson, who had operated the post for 15 years, greeted them with gruff hospitality. He had been informed of the upcoming meeting and had prepared the main room accordingly, with a large table surrounded by sufficient seating for representatives from all parties involved. "Never thought I'd see the day," he commented, as he showed them the arrangements. Army brass and Comanche chiefs at the same table, talking instead of shooting. "First steps on new path," Swift Shadow replied. "Small steps, but important." "Well, if anyone can make it work, it's folks like you two," Jacobson said, surprising them both with his endorsement. "Word travels about what you did, exposing them raiders, proving they was playing both sides against the middle." News of their role in uncovering Reed's conspiracy had indeed spread throughout the territory, taking on the embellishments and simplifications typical of frontier stories. In some versions, Catherine had single-handedly defeated a dozen attackers. In others, Swift Shadow had dramatic, supernatural abilities that allowed him to track criminals across impossible terrain. The truth, while less sensational, had nonetheless earned them a unique respect in communities that rarely agreed on anything. After inspecting the meeting arrangements and discussing security measures with Jacobson, they decided to remain at the trading post overnight. The proprietor offered them separate quarters, a small room for Catherine and a lean-to shelter for Swift Shadow that was frequently used by indigenous traders who preferred not to sleep inside the main building. As evening approached, they sat together on a bench outside the trading post, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The familiar ritual of day's end in the open country brought a companionable silence between them, comfortable in a way that formal meetings in the fort could never be. "What will you do?" Swift Shadow asked eventually, when justice finished. "Reed punished? Peace talks completed?" The question caught Catherine unprepared, though it had been lingering at the edges of her thoughts for days. What future awaited her once her immediate purpose was fulfilled? "I've been considering that," she admitted. "I could return to St. Louis. My mother's sister is there. She would welcome me, help me establish a proper life again." Even as she said the words, Catherine recognized their hollow quality. The woman who could be satisfied with that life no longer existed. "Or," Swift Shadow prompted, sensing her hesitation. "Or I could stay," she continued, the alternative feeling more right as she gave it voice. "Marshal Thornton has suggested I might have a future in territorial administration. He believes my unique perspective, having witnessed both the worst, corruption and the possibility of genuine cooperation, would be valuable as the territory develops." Swift Shadow considered this, his expression thoughtful in the fading light. "Good path," he said finally, "building bridges where walls once stood." "And you?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious about his plans. "Will you return to your people's traditional ways once these negotiations are complete?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "My path also changed," he acknowledged. "Cannot return only to old ways after walking between worlds." He turned to face her more directly. "Chief Grey Wolf asks me to continue as voice between peoples, learn more of white man's laws, help Comanche understand new boundaries, new agreements." "That's a significant responsibility," Catherine observed, impressed but not surprised by the trust placed in him. "Yes, difficult path." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Lonely path sometimes. Belong fully to neither world. Unless," Catherine suggested carefully, "you find others walking the same path beside you." The implication hung between them, not a declaration, but an acknowledgement of possibility. Something shifted in Swift Shadow's expression, a softening of the guardedness he typically maintained. "Two rivers joining," he said quietly, "become stronger current." Catherine nodded, understanding the metaphor and appreciating its truth. They were indeed like two rivers from different sources, converging to create something with greater purpose and strength than either could achieve alone. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained side by side on that simple bench, contemplating futures neither could have imagined before fate and courage had drawn their paths together. The journey ahead would not be easy. Bridging divided worlds never was, but in that moment of shared understanding, both recognized they had found something rare and precious on the frontier. Not just survival or justice, but the promise of a new way forward, together. The next morning, Catherine woke to the sound of approaching riders. Marshal Thornton and his deputies arriving a day early to secure the site before the formal peace talks. As she stepped outside, fastening her uncle's watch to her belt, as had become her habit, she was struck by how different her world looked compared to just 1 month before. Where once she had seen only the harsh, unforgiving nature of the frontier, a place of danger and loss, she now recognized its potential for renewal and transformation. The very canyon that had nearly claimed her life had also revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. The cultural divisions that had seemed unbridgeable now showed the first tentative spans of understanding extending across the chasm. Swift Shadow approached, leading both their horses, already saddled for the return journey to Fort Davis. "Ready?" he asked simply. Catherine Blackwood, once a judge's sheltered niece, and now a woman who had found her true purpose in the wilderness, nodded with quiet confidence. "Yes," she replied, "for whatever comes next." As they rode together toward the fort, where representatives of two long-conflicted peoples would soon gather to begin the difficult work of building peace, Catherine realized that the greatest legacy of her ordeal was not merely survival or even justice for those lost, but the discovery that even the deepest canyons could become pathways to unexpected destinations, if one had the courage to follow them to their end. The lone survivor of a stagecoach massacre and the Comanche tracker who had found her when all she had left was the will to survive had forged something powerful from tragedy, a partnership that bridged worlds, a purpose that transcended personal loss, and a future that promised to transform the very frontier that had nearly destroyed them both. As the morning sun illuminated the path ahead, Catherine touched the bracelet still encircling her wrist, 7 stones for 7 acts of courage, and knew with certainty that the greatest adventures of her life were just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us.